Medieval Europe, an age of romance and chivalry, of bloody feuds and barbaric wars. Dominating the landscape stood the castle, the ultimate symbol of power. Savagely fought over, castles were the focus of untold brutality. Stone against flesh, blood against stone. This is the story of heroic deeds and devilish machines. The story of a castle in its most deadly hour. At the height of the Middle Ages, armored knights ruled the battlefield. In return for land and honor, these mounted warriors risked life and limb for lord and king. Their gallantry in love and war is still the most enduring image we have of this bygone world. But the truth was much more grim. Most battles were fought by poorly paid mercenaries and common peasants, and most centered on castles. Castles controlled the land and the people around it. To attack one through siege warfare was the most complex challenge facing the medieval military commander.
Most medieval warfare turned on either holding or capturing castles. They were like pieces on in the chessboard. The person who had the most castles and the most strategically important castles at the end could walk away from that war considering himself the winner.
Over the centuries, the art of siege warfare evolved into a standardized series of moves and counter-moves. Like a game of chess, it became a battle of wits. Survival depended on bluff. Flawed strategy meant death. Chess became extremely popular among the warrior nobility of the day because it reflected military tactics. As in the game, only great cunning and sheer determination could win the day and bring glory to the victor. If the warring nobles loved anything better than battle itself, it was hearing their gallant exploits recounted by the chroniclers of the time. The most acclaimed is Jean Froissart, courtier, monk, secretary to monarchs, and considered by many to be the first true war correspondent. Jean Froissart was born in the Flemish town of Valenciennes in 1337, the same year that history's longest conflict, the 100 Years' War, erupted between England and France. The dispute was over land. Both kingdoms claimed rights over the Duchy of Normandy, ancestral home of the English kings. Its strategic location and rich farmland made the tiny principality a prize worth fighting for, and led to 117 years of bloodshed, ruination, and death. Fascinated by power and political intrigue, Froissart set out to witness many of the campaigns and sieges fought during this chaotic time. To have a writer of Froissart's reputation at your court, recording your deeds in battle, was a coup indeed. He excelled at extracting information from men on both sides of the conflict, relishing every detail of bravery, heroism, and cruelty. As the full range of military tactics was rarely employed at any one siege, the following story is compiled from many of the episodes which Froissart describes in his chronicles. He wrote, I have always made inquiries to the best of my ability about the exact course of the war, and I shall write a chronicle in praise of the noble adventures and feats of arms that have taken place, so others might be inspired to follow such examples.
War was a fact of life. It was one of the main ways in which people solved their disputes. Unlike today, there weren't many institutions that people could appeal to settle their disputes peacefully. And the political elites of the day were themselves warriors, and therefore settling their disputes through warfare came naturally to them.
Let us suppose that in the 1390s, the King of England sends an army into France to enforce his claims on Normandy. The English knights would prefer to fight in open battle, but the French, following a number of disastrous defeats, now rely on castles as their first line of defense. Built at crossroads, hilltops, and river crossings, castles commanded nearly every position of strategic importance. For the English commander to control the land, he must capture any castle that lies in his path.
Somebody living in a modest medieval village just made up of a few huts, a huge castle must have literally loomed over them like a sort of big, dark presence. It was power written in stone for everybody to see.
By the end of the 14th century, castles had evolved from simple wooden forts to imposing stone citadels. An outer gatehouse, called a barbican, guards the main road leading into the fortress. Walls extending from the barbican enclose an area known as the outer ward. Within this ring lies the moat, and a second wall enclosing the middle ward. Another, even taller wall protects the third, inner ward. At its heart looms the keep, a central tower that would be the final refuge should an enemy manage to overrun all other defenses. The skills and secrets of castle building were highly prized during the Middle Ages.
And there's one story from France in the days of William the Conqueror that a man who specialized in building castles was commissioned to build a state-of-the-art castle and was then promptly killed by the Lord so that he couldn't pass on his secrets to any of his rivals.
This castle, with a garrison of only 200 men, stands directly in the path of the English. But castles were designed to be held by a small force. A century earlier, 37 soldiers successfully held Harlech Castle in Wales against an entire army. Like the men at Harlech, the French commander knows that to survive, his garrison must be thoroughly prepared and constantly vigilant. As the 1,800 English soldiers march across Normandy, they travel much faster than their lumbering supply wagons, forcing the army to live off the land. Froissart recalled, "All these warlike men took to the field, and the whole country began to tremble before them." Aware that the invaders are foraging for food, the French initiate a scorched earth policy, burning crops, orchards, storehouses, and entire villages to deny food and shelter to the approaching enemy. Peasants, driven from their homes, are conscripted to work and fight for the French. Normandy is thus ravaged by the French and English alike. For the villages, war could not have come at a worse time. It is early October. Spring supplies have already run low, and the autumn harvest has not yet come in. Froissart recalls, "So was the good, fat land of Normandy ravaged and burnt, plundered and pillaged. Where it had been well stocked, they left it broken and devastated behind them." The French peasants bring all food, building materials and weapons into the castle, vital if this garrison is going to hold out for any time against the enemy. When Caerphilly Castle in Wales came under siege, their force numbered only 130 men, but they were well stocked and provisioned. At the end of the siege, their stores still held 800 shafts for lances, 14 Danish axes, 1,000 crossbow bolts fitted with hedgehog quills, 100 quarters each of wheat and beans, 78 carcasses of oxen, 280 of mutton, 72 hams, 1,800 of stockfish, 6 barrels of red wine and 1 barrel of white.
Okay, Sergeant, close the gates. Close the gate. In, sir, in.
This castle has already withstood numerous sieges. Its battle scars are painfully visible. To survive another, repairs must be made to the aging walls and towers. But the French cannot rely solely on their castle and its small contingent of knights and men-at-arms to hold off the English. So experienced soldiers and knights train the conscripted peasants to fight in the coming battle.
Now, once more, fight and watch the feet.
There are accounts of practice sessions. It would appear that your older warriors will train your younger ones. And you will be told by your father, by your brothers, by your male relatives, by your female relatives how you should run a siege. But basically you have to learn it on the job because every siege will be different anyway.
Most of these men are simple farmers, about to face battle-hardened English knights for the first time. Even rudimentary training will help them defend the castle and may save their lives. While the soldiers train, long-range artillery engines are brought out of storage and assembled in the inner ward as a further deterrent to the invaders.
Prepare to loose.
The French commander is confident that his careful preparations and the castle's massive stone walls will more than compensate for his meager force. But he also knows that provisions are just as important as weapons and defenses.
A castle that's well supplied can hold out for a very long time, as long as they don't lose their water supplies. They may start to suffer from disease, they may have to throw out all their non-combatants, but they could hold out for 18 months.
To conserve food, all non-essential personnel are driven from the castle. With the garrison reduced to soldiers only, its limited provisions should prove adequate for nearly 3 months. The peasants have little choice but to return to their burned-out homes and villages and hope the approaching English will simply ignore them. But as the English advance, the little resistance they meet is ruthlessly crushed. As Froissart gravely notes, there were many ugly cases of pillage and murder, arson and robbery, for in an army it was impossible that there should not be many bad characters and criminals without conscience. The land was undone and darkened with evil deeds, and men said openly that Christ and his angels slept. One could easily make a day's journey without ever finding a village inhabited. Although he had witnessed hundreds of battles, even Froissart was shocked at such brutality. He continued, "The chase endured to the gates. All who were found there were put to the sword. I do not understand how they could have failed to take pity on people who were too unimportant to have posed any threat." After 5 grueling weeks on the march, the English arrive exhausted, but determined to put on the most impressive show of force they can muster. Hoping to avoid the inevitable carnage of a full-scale siege, the English surround the fortress to display their strength of numbers and cut off any possible escape route. If their presence is intimidating enough, the French may surrender without a fight. The French, in turn, do their best to convince their enemy they are too powerful to be taken. The English, shown here in red, the French in blue, have no way of knowing whether 100 or 1,000 men guard the fortress. But their orders from the king are clear. Bring the castle to its knees, no matter the cost. In siege warfare, as in a game of chess, the number of men often matter less than their rank or position on the board. Each piece found its equivalent among the ranks of the medieval army. Foot soldiers and archers, like pawns, would greatly outnumber the knights. Our story, based on a compilation of Froissart's chronicles, examines how these pieces were used in the various strategies mounted against the defiant castles. A siege amounts to no more than two armies on opposite sides of a wall. For one side to gain advantage over the other, each move must be carefully planned and executed. A siege is not a battle of glory, but a grueling contest of cunning, patience, and nerve.
Care was taken sometimes to make sure that the people inside the castle knew that a siege was happening. Very often the convention was to fire one arrow into the gate of the castle. And this was the formal way in which those outside were saying to those inside, now a formal siege has started.
At this stage, either army could still withdraw without loss of honor. But first, the English herald must formally demand the castle to surrender.
Be it known that I, herald to Harry, King of England, do command you to offer up this castle to his armies. What say you?
Go back to your...
A French refusal at this point will leave the English no option except to prepare for battle. Forced into action, the English now initiate the first move with a direct attack on the heavily fortified outer gate. By breaching this gate, they could gain an important foothold inside the castle.
Very often medieval armies, at the point of contact between them, were partly drunk. Commanders in the 100 Years' War make a point of issuing wine to their soldiers immediately before they tried to storm a castle, because they knew that if the man's inhibitions were brought down a little bit by alcohol, they were more likely to sort of attack vigorously.
The outer gate is taken with surprisingly little effort, but the English now find themselves facing an even more daunting set of defenses. Although now in control of the outer ward, they must still overcome the moat and two heavily fortified gates. At the end of the first round of battle, the castle still stands firm. Before incurring further losses, the English commander must carefully consider his next move. Committing to a siege is a serious undertaking. Diplomacy and the code of chivalry dictate that after the initial display of force, the French must be given a second opportunity to surrender.
Once more, I, herald to the king, do command you to offer up this castle. What say you?
Despite being outnumbered 9-1, the French are defiant and refuse to surrender. With admiration, Froissart recalls the words of the French commander. "You will not take this land whilst one stone stands upon another." If the English want the fortress, they will have to take it by force. After just 2 days, the English are aware that this siege will be demanding. Spirits in the camp are mixed. The haughty knights hate sieges because opportunities for personal acts of valor are scarce as long as the castle walls stand intact. The common soldiers are, however, heartened by the success of the attack on the outer gate. Within the castle, the French are hoping to avoid a prolonged siege. A messenger sneaks out under cover of night in a daring attempt to press the French king for help. Worried about the repercussions of letting the French messenger slip through his fingers, the English commander calls his knights together to discuss an immediate attack. The plan is to make a daring assault on the inner walls of the castle to further wear away the French defenses.
Take the left wall, the flank wall.
Simultaneous attacks are launched at various points along the walls, provoking the French to reveal their true numbers. As the scalers cross the moat and race across the killing ground to the middle wall, they are easy targets for French crossbowmen. But the English return fire at 4 times the rate of the crossbow. Wave after wave of men surge against the walls under cover of a hail of arrows fired by the English archers. Many never reach their goal. Froissart records, "From the battlements they hurled stones and flints and pots of quicklime, which inflicted terrible wounds on those they fell upon." Each time the scalers gain a footing on the parapet, the French beat them back, killing scores in the process. To make matters more difficult, some of the French defenders are hidden within wooden hoardings erected along the battlements. From here, in relative safety, they can fire outward and downward on the enemy, making the assault deadlier than ever. The escalade is a notorious meat grinder. The English have lost nearly 20% of their attackers and failed to take the wall. But the level of resistance indicates that the castle is held by only a few hundred men. For the French command, a pause, then bad news. A messenger has arrived under a flag of truce, bringing word from the King of France. His Majesty cannot yet spare a force to relieve the siege. The castle must stand firm and fight, whatever the cost. The English are left with little option but to dig in for a prolonged siege. The soldiers battle the boredom of waiting by sharpening their fighting skills. The siege could take weeks, even months. Both the soldiers and women try to make life in the camp seem as normal as possible.
Excuse me, sorry.
Medieval armies were really a reflection of the society. Representatives of all levels of society were engaged in warfare. The aristocracy was a military aristocracy. Townspeople provided militias and were involved in warfare. And a great many of the foot soldiers would have been people drawn from the villages in the countryside. increasingly, it's a cross-section of the whole of medieval society. There's not one professional caste which dominates fighting in this period. It involves a great many types of people.
If people know they're there for a while, they will start growing their own food as well, their own vegetables. So they've got something to live off. And the baker will set up his oven and start baking bread. So it's actually, it's a small community.
Women play an important role in the camp.
Most medieval armies had a large contingent of prostitutes following them, and this was expected. It was part of the routine services supplied by people to any medieval army. If an army failed, moralists would say they failed because they had too many prostitutes with them and didn't have the sort of right intention which would have earned them victory.
English hopes for victory lay with their archers, who possessed one weapon feared throughout Europe, the longbow. Because of its devastating power and accuracy, the longbow was one of the most deadly weapons on the medieval battlefield.
Do a bit of good on those knights' armours, that will.
Introduced into the English army early in the 13th century, the Welsh longbow has a range of over 400 yards, with a firing rate of 12 arrows per minute. In 1346, 6,000 English longbowmen opened the Battle of Crecy by firing 72,000 arrows in the first 90 seconds, cutting the French army to ribbons. At a siege some years later, Froissart records that the English archers stood behind their breastworks by the banks of the moat, shooting so steadily that the defenders hardly dare to show themselves on the battlements. They poured out their arrows so thickly and evenly that they fell like snow upon the heads of the enemy. But the French stubbornly rely on the crossbow for both offense and defense. The crossbow is an ideal weapon in a siege because it demands little physical strength or training to use. A conscripted peasant can master it in a few hours, as opposed to the years it takes for the longbow. Although powerful enough to drop a charging horse at short range, the crossbow is slow to load and inaccurate at long range. English archers are so hated that the French swear to cut off the first 2 fingers of any they capture, ruining them forever as bowmen. The English retaliate in defiance, displaying both fingers intact. Such taunts are one of the soldiers' few distractions from the boredom between attacks. As the weeks pass, they become cold, hungry, homesick, and more than occasionally, quarrelsome.
What are you doing playing around?
The English commander knows that something will have to be tried if he is to keep his men under his command. He begins to formulate a new plan of attack. For weeks now, the English have been probing for weaknesses in the castle defenses while fortifying their own position. It is clear the castle will not fall easily. The level of violence must now rise in the hope of forcing the siege to an end. Froissart knows the English can retaliate with even more formidable force. He records, "The English now devised various means of attack to wear down the garrison through the construction of machines to harass the besieged. They set up great engines to hurl missiles by night and day onto the roof and the towers, which did much damage. The easiest siege engine for the English army to construct while in the field is the Perrier. With muscle power alone, the sling arm of the Perrier can launch a medium-sized boulder with enough force to send it crashing through a wooden roof. The effects of such punishing bombardment was clear at the siege of Acre in 1191, where an engine shook down a great part of the tower and wall of the castle. The French retaliate with their own contraption, known as a mangonel. These machines can hurl a medium-sized rock over 500 yards, beyond the reach of any archer, turning the battle into a contest between siege engines. The bombardment also makes a good cover for a bit of subterfuge. Where brute force has failed, cunning may give the English the upper hand. Under the very noses of the French, an English spy approaches. His goal is to enter the castle through an often undefended opening, the latrine chute. The English commander is eager to uncover the extent of the French arsenal, especially the firepower of their siege engines. Success would give the English a much-needed advantage. Failure would mean certain death for the spy. The English now call a halt to the direct assault, looking to regroup and consolidate their forces. Conditions in both the camp and castle are beginning to deteriorate. While the knights and nobles live in tents, common soldiers are left asleep on the ground. Froissart noted, "The morning chill struck through their whole bodies, giving them sickness and fever and afflicting them with dysentery, of which they inevitably died."
One of the most common features of medieval chroniclers is that they always knew when they turned up at a siege because you could smell it some way off, and the stench of sieges, of the camps outside, was meant to be horrific. Rotting corpses, uncooked food, poor sanitary conditions all contributed to a dreadful smell. Far more people would have died from disease and sometimes starvation than they would have done through fighting.
Even during this lull in the fighting, the English are in constant peril. They cannot sleep, drink, or pray without being vulnerable to a French sniper. The temptation to desert must be very great, but to do so and be caught would mean execution and a lifetime of misery for the families they would leave behind. Froissart senses their plight, but all he can do is wait and watch. The frustration of the siege drives noblemen on both sides to rash acts of brutality. Inside the castle, the English spy has been caught and ruthlessly interrogated. Determined to set an example their enemy will remember, the French impose swift, brutal justice. As a gesture of defiance, the severed head of the spy is launched into the English camp, while the French soldiers mock their enemy's failed attempt at espionage. Furious and frustrated, the English vow to crush the French. They now bring forward the massive trebuchet, a siege machine which works by counterweight rather than muscle power, and can deliver far heavier payloads across even greater distances. When England's King Edward I besieged Stirling Castle in 1304, a crew of 50 carpenters took 3 weeks to construct the huge device, with a throwing arm of over 60 foot, large enough to demolish a small fortress. The trebuchet could also be used to gruesome effect. As well as stones, animal carcasses and plague victims were thrown into castles to spread terror and disease among the inhabitants. Even more fearsome was the devilish concoction called Greek fire. A napalm-like substance that even burnt underwater. It was said it was only possible to extinguish by dousing the flames with stale urine, vinegar, or other acid solutions. Greek fire was probably invented by the Byzantines in the 7th century and brought to Europe by the Crusaders. Although the exact recipe has been lost for centuries, it was believed to be a mixture of sulfur, tar, pitch, boiled salt, and oil. Some mixtures were liquid, others were solid. In a camp, the fire bombs could burn both tents and siege engines, and inside a castle, they would land like the wrath of God, setting fire to people and buildings alike. The horror was no stranger to Froissart. Then they began to fire their engines. The fire, which was Greek fire, set the roof of the tower alight, forcing the men to abandon it hurriedly to save themselves from being burnt to death. Many were killed and wounded. The fire assault proves effective. The roof of a tower and one of the hoardings in a storehouse of food have been burnt to the ground. Despite 2 weeks of almost constant artillery bombardment, the castle still stands firm. The only means left for the English to breach the wall is to dig underneath it. The mine was perhaps the most lethal weapon in the besiegers' arsenal, and something the French fear the most. Back in the castle, a sentinel is posted day and night over a pan of water. A tiny ripple on the water's surface will betray men digging beneath the ground. Tunneling under the moat, the miners are looking to reach the base of the wall to undermine its foundations. After 2 weeks of digging, the small force has reached the middle wall. The miners run along its base, ferreting out weaknesses. The French, fully roused, now bring to bear on them one of the most versatile engines of the medieval arsenal, the ballista. Essentially a giant crossbow, it is capable of hurling stones or javelins up to 300 yards. Although lacking the range of the trebuchet, the ballista is so powerful that it can rip through several men at one shot. Centuries earlier, during the siege of Paris in 885, the sight of several attackers skewered together raised the remark that they should be taken to the kitchen and cooked like so many fowl on a spit. The miners finally find a suitable place to work, and stones are torn away. Several days of digging creates a cavity in the wall. The work is slow and dangerous, but if successful, brutally effective. The chamber, supported by stout wooden beams, is then filled with twigs, wood, and pig carcasses. when the contents of the chamber are set on fire, the intense heat will cause the hog carcasses to swell and explode, their grease serving to fuel the inferno. As the support posts are consumed in the blaze, the masonry above tears itself loose from the surrounding wall with a thundering crash. Even before the dust settles, the English swarm into the breach. The French pull men from other points along the wall in a furious attempt to hold back the English. But the sheer number of invaders is overwhelming, and the besieged are steadily pushed back until they are finally forced to retreat to the inner ward. The battle leaves the English in control of the middle ward. Although the English now hold more than half the castle, the French still control the inner ward and the heavily fortified central keep. After 2 months of bloody combat, discipline is low on both sides.
It was very difficult to keep order. Very often the question of law and order became one of trying to impose a moral order on an army. For example, Henry V, when he invaded France in 1417, said that if any prostitute was found in the army besieging Rouen, they would have their arms broken. Very often commanders laid down edicts that their soldiers shouldn't gamble or visit brothels or swear.
Suffering on both sides is now acute. The death rate from infected wounds is high, and shortages of food are forcing the men and women to eat anything they can lay their hands on. Dogs, cats, mice, and even rats. But in the castle, they are facing the most serious threat of all, a shortage of water. Soldiers suffering from thirst have been known to drink their horses' blood, each other's urine, and even bury themselves in damp earth in the hope of absorbing some moisture. With fights over water now breaking out in the castle, the French know that they will only be able to hold out for a matter of days.
And break it up, you two! Save your aggression for the English!
Unaware of how serious the French situation is, the English commander decides to make a last desperate bid to overwhelm the garrison. To surmount the walls of the inner ward, the English engineers have been constructing an enormous siege tower. Froissart is incredulous. They set numbers of carpenters to work building a large tower with 3 stories, which could be moved about on wheels. Each story could hold a good 24 men with room enough for use of their weapons. The tower was provided with firing loopholes and was sheathed in wood and covered with wet leather as a protection against fire and heavy bolts from the defenders' crossbows. The English knights are launched into glorious bloody combat. Froissart records, "The garrison had seen the tower being built and had a clear idea of the plan of attack. They engaged in open combat with the men in the tower, fighting hand to hand. When they had had enough of this, they began to fling fire on top of the tower and inside of it, by which many of the besiegers were killed and wounded." Over 150 knights and men-at-arms are cut down in this desperate attempt to overwhelm the walls, but to no avail. After 89 days of almost continual fighting, the English are exhausted and demoralized. Desertion is becoming commonplace. The commander realizes his men are near breaking point. The only way left to take the castle and still keep his army together is simply to wait. If he can't overwhelm the French, he will starve them out. In the castle, supplies of both food and water are completely used up. Despite the success against the siege tower, the French knights do not feel they can hold out much longer. They press their commander to consider surrender.
Captain, I urge you, the Lord, surely the horses they are rein, sir. We are done for.
No,
When he remains adamant, his council begins to question his judgment.
The walls will hold. The king will
The
say.
men will not, sir, with all due respect.
The French commander knows that if he surrenders now, the spiteful English will butcher the entire garrison. Better to starve to death with honor than be executed in disgrace.
Rider approaching!
But just as victory seems within reach for the English, a messenger brings disastrous news. A massive French relief force is heading towards the besieged castle. The English are out of options and out of time. The commander of the English force realizes that abandoning the siege endangers the entire campaign. But he also knows that if he remains, his army will be trapped between the advancing relief force and the defenders still holding the castle.
The battle goes poorly, my lord.
After hours of deliberation, the English commander reluctantly admits that with the main French army only 5 days' march away, he must abandon the siege immediately. As a final act of defiance, they will leave during the night, so the garrison will be unaware of the English withdrawal. The next morning, the English camp seems ominously quiet until a French scouting party discovers that their prayers have been answered. The siege is over. Both sides have suffered appalling losses. If there is any real winner here, it is only the castle itself. Despite an outnumbered and poorly trained garrison, short supplies and bitter cold, the castle has withstood all attempts to bring it to bay.
The fact that so many castles survive for so long shows that usually the people inside won. Our evidence tends to focus more on the successful sieges, perhaps because they were fairly unusual. At least sieges that were brought to a rapid conclusion were quite rare. So by and large, castles worked.
Finally free to leave the castle, Froissart rides out through the English camp, astonished by how quickly they vanished. He remarked, "In their encampment, they left all the baggage they had, trunks, beds, and other things." Jean Froissart survived to record many more sieges and battles. He died peacefully in 1410 at the age of 73. But the war between England and France would drag on for more than 4 decades after his death. He wrote, "What has been seen so far is nothing beside what is to come, and there shall be no peace nor end before the realm of France has been wasted and destroyed in every district and region. Of the 28 major sieges mounted by the English and French during the 100 Years' War, only one was an unqualified success. Countless millions died in the struggle to determine who held the rightful title to Normandy. In 1453, after 7 generations of slaughter and bloodshed, the war finally crawled to an end. By then, the siege too was becoming a thing of the past, with only the great castles of Europe standing in mute testament to the age of castles at war.